Good evening, everyone. My name is John Tiggs, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Inanuak, and Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are, of course, gathered here tonight to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Bad Houses, the tremendous new collection of stories from store favorite, John Elizabeth Stintzi. Much thanks to Arsenal Pulp Press for publishing this book, for being such an incredible publisher, and to all of you for joining us here to celebrate its Winnipeg launch. One of the pleasures to celebrate great books in community is being able to team up with folks like Plume Winnipeg, formerly the Winnipeg International Writers Festival, to present evenings such as this. And you'll be hearing from Plume's director, Charlene Deal, at the close of this event. This has been a hard-fought event, and we're thrilled to be moving ahead. We had originally hoped to have Stintzi here in April of 2020 to celebrate the incredible Vanishing Monuments in June Mat, but something prevented that from happening, making this evening even more a cause for celebration, as their brilliant and entirely unique work should be read by anyone with a pulse and a passion for the possibilities of the written word. Their work has been described positively as really weird shit, to which I would add deliciously, delightfully, mind-expanding weird shit. So we're thrilled to have them here tonight. The evening will flow pretty naturally. In a moment, our host, Nora Decter, will come up behind this podium and introduce John Elizabeth Stintzi, following which there'll be a reading. There'll then be a conversation that'll take place on these stools to my left. We're going to eschew questions this evening. If you do have any questions for the author, please feel free to ask them in the signing line, as there is plenty of conversation ahead for us all. And Charlene will be back at the end of the event to let you know how you can get books signed. But for now, your host, Nora Decter, is a writer from Treaty 1 territory. She studied creative writing at York University and Stony Brook University, and in 2019 received the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize for Literary Fiction for her YA novel, How Far We Go and How Fast. Her novel, What's Not Mine, was published in spring of 2024 by ECW Press. Nora lives in Winnipeg with her partner and their 2 cats near the foot of Garbage Hill, and is currently serving as the writer-in-residence at the Winnipeg Public Library for the 2024 to 2025 term, so get in touch for a consultation. Please join me in welcoming Nora Decter.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone to the long-awaited Winnipeg launch of Jess's Bad Houses. Hopefully we'll talk about that wait in a moment, but for now, John Elizabeth Stintzi is a writer, cartoonist, and editor who grew up on a cattle farm in northwestern Ontario. Their work has been awarded the 2019 RBC Bronwyn Wallace Award for Emerging Writers, the Malahat Review's 2019 Long Poem Prize, the Seder New Works Award, and has been shortlisted for the Amazon Canada First Novel Award and the Raymond Schuster Award, In addition to Bad Houses, Jess is the author of the novels My Volcano and Vanishing Monuments, the poetry collection June Mat, and the comic The Children of Gold Crew. They are also at work illustrating their first graphic novel, Automaton Deactivation Bureau. But back to the cattle farm for a moment. From there, Jess came here to Winnipeg to study at the University of Manitoba, then went on to Long Island, New York for their MFA, followed by a stint in Jersey City, before most recently calling Kansas City home base. I mention this somewhat oddball personal geography because I think it echoes the unexpected trajectories in Bad Houses, whose stories move in surprising, defiant directions. On a personal note, I met Jess in 2014, so just over 10 years ago now. We were both students in that aforementioned MFA program at Stony Brook University in Southampton, New York. And at the beginning of the first semester, I heard this rumor that there was another Canadian student. And somebody told me, someone who shall remain nameless, that they were from, that you just were from Toronto. And a couple of,
Thanks that.
it took a few weeks after that before we crossed paths. It's kind of like a medium-sized program. And perhaps you're all aware that writers are not notoriously very social creatures. But finally we met, and I was like, I hear you're from Toronto. And you were like, no, I'm from a cattle farm in northwestern Ontario and have lived in Winnipeg more recently. So first thing I thought was typical Americans making huge 2,000-kilometer generalizations about Canada. But my next reaction was to be thrilled because while meeting someone from Toronto would have been nice, meeting someone else with ties to Manitoba in the Hamptons seemed pretty unlikely, and even going so far as to be special. So then I took a class with Jess and was like, damn, this kid can really write. I was 28 and I think you were probably 22? 22, 23. Well, I felt much older than wiser than you, as one does in one's 20s. But you can really write, and not just in one genre either. As their list of publications suggests, Jess is an incredibly interdisciplinary writer in both writing and their broader art practice. And Bad Houses itself is sort of staggeringly hybrid, not only for the deft strangeness of a tale like Midas's hairdresser, but also because Jess's own illustrations accompany each story. And for the record, many writers think that they should design their own book cover, but not many actually should or do, so that's notable. Author of What Strange Paradise, Omar El-Akkad called Bad Houses a rare, incomparable collection, surreal yet firmly anchored to the mechanics of contemporary living. And cartoonist Michael DeForge said, Stintzi paints a portrait of our current moment from a dizzying array of vantage points. A poet laureate of calamity. Indeed, the vantage points in Bad Houses are dizzying in their various calamities, riotously imaginative in their plots, while remaining deeply serious in their exploration of what it's like to be human. In Moving Parts, a university student leaves home for school, only to find that every semester some new, seemingly essential part of them vanishes. In Pathetic Fallacy, a writer sits down to work on their novel, nostalgic about the winters of their childhood, as an unprecedented snowfall begins to fall outside their apartment. And in Foundations, the novella that concludes the collection, an artist is haunted by her past, resigned to her present, and increasingly unsettled by the strange occurrences at a construction site in her rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. To borrow some words from Coco Picard, author of The Healing Circle, each story in Bad Houses offers a window into the unique and uncanny architectures where our lives play out. The way invisible walls come up amongst roommates, how two lovers navigate an elephant's corpse in their apartment, or even how the neighbor's laundry left wet for a week and mildewed comes knocking on Halloween. Characters go in and out of houses, up and down apartment stairs, in and out of screens, on and off apps, and identities. Now, without further ado, I'll invite Jess to give us a taste of the uncanny architecture of Bad Houses.
Thank you, Nora. That was much, I don't know, I didn't expect as much introducing it. I feel so important and so, I don't know, talented. Maybe I should. So I'm gonna read the start of the first couple stories, and then we're gonna converse for a little while, and then I'll come back up here and read a little bit more. And the first story is, that I'm gonna read from is Dumb House. One day, our roommate came home, painted her face white, and stopped speaking. She piled all her chromatic clothes in a hamper outside her door, and the next day, after dragging them 3 blocks to a thrift shop, came back to the house with bags of new clothes. Everything was white and black. Every shirt was striped. Our other roommate and I confronted her as she was carrying those bags into the house. We asked her what she was doing. She didn't respond. She just stared at us, a perfectly shaped, big, black painted tear ever dripping from the far corner of her left eye. Her hair, newly dyed jet black, was stuffed up into a small beret. She put down her bags and lifted her hands out to the space between herself and us and began patting at the gap. It was solid. There was an invisible barrier. We watched as she inspected the entirety of the hall, running her hands from edge to edge, floor to ceiling. Finding no gaps, her face went somehow more blank as she began to beat her fists on the thick space. Her hands bruised, but she couldn't break through. She started trying to push the wall. Her feet slipped on the floor behind her. We took a few steps back, and the invisible wall followed us, with her still pushing at it. We didn't reach out to touch the wall, not then, and not for a while. We preferred to think about the wall as performance rather than reality. So we stepped back until she pushed it far enough that she could get into her room. At that point, she stopped pushing, caught her breath, picked up the bags of clothes, and carried them inside. She was still paying rent at first, but she'd stopped going to work. She'd been interning for a literary agency for a few months since Christmas. She would read what the agents had agreed to look at personally. She knew what they would feel was worthy. She grabbed coffee, schmoozed authors who were writing real books that real people might eventually read and whose manuscripts circumvented her. She ordered new business cards for everyone in the agency. She ordered business cards for herself that had no position title except writer. She wasn't even writing anymore. We scoured her social media. We were trying to figure it all out. She hadn't tweeted, her LinkedIn account was deactivated, and we couldn't find her OkCupid, where we would occasionally sign on to tease one another, to fake flirt as characters who were clearly serial killers trying to lure their next kills. We could no longer tell her that she loved our basement because it was so erotically dark. The profile pic on all her remaining social media accounts changed. In this new monochromatic photo, she stared deep into the camera. The camera stared back into her. But even in that photo, the thick, invisible wall was deepening the picture's flatness. And the next story that I'm going to read from is called Grandpa's Bag of Bubonics Brood, which is a mouthful, but it's so fun to say. When I feel bad, I play with my Jesus action figure. Then I feel less bad, and I start to feel sorry. Sorry for yelling at my grandma and calling her names under my breath after being talked to for letting another dish rot in my bedroom. Sorry for laughing at a neighbor kid falling in the street. Sorry for lying. When I play with my Jesus action figure, I feel goodness coming into my body from him, because my Jesus action figure has real sin cleansing action, which means that whenever I touch him against people, they start to shine. They turn good. But he hasn't always had that power. He didn't have that power when my grandpa gave him to me last Easter, after the bunny forgot to come barf his eggs up on our lawn, the day before Mom left. My Jesus got the power when I took him to church a week later and tried to drown him in a bowl of holy water after the service was done and everyone was in the basement eating slices of lemon bread and drinking cups of his blood. I was angry at Jesus for reasons I don't need to get into, them being in the past, and I decided Jesus was going to get drowned for them. I was a different kid back then. Of course, Jesus can't drown, even in action figure form. He is not a bag of kittens, like the one my grandpa drowned down in the river where I saw a cottonmouth swim around once. He drowned those kittens the day before I tried to drown Jesus. I was with my grandpa when he did it. I'm not saying that one of the reasons that convinced me Jesus was a bad guy who deserved drowning was making kittens too expensive to keep alive, but the fact is they are. That's just the fact. I learned even more especially that Jesus definitely can't be drowned in holy water. When I tried, it only made him stronger, so that now he cleanses sins. After a bit of being submerged in the holy water, he got his sin-cleansing powers and made me good. And since good kids don't drown Jesus, I stopped drowning him. Now I'm good, but the goodness does tend to wear off, and I've got to re-cleanse now and again, badness being a hard thing to permanently lose. I took my sin-cleansing Jesus home with me that day after church. My grandparents were next door for after church tea with the neighbors. So my sister was the only one home when I got back, herself having slipped out of church early to watch daytime TV with people screaming at each other and calling each other bad, as she usually did. Those kinds of shows relaxed her, made her feel more okay. My sister was just sitting on the couch, popping bubble gum she'd stolen a few days before. I walked over to her and placed the head of Jesus on her forehead. And that's it for now.
Thank you for reading us 2 selections to start off with. I do have questions about those stories, but just kind of more generally first, a bit of a meta question. It feels, at least from my perspective, like this book has been a really long time coming. Not just like this Winnipeg book launch, which is your 4th book and your first time getting to come here, so welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
But perhaps it's just my perspective, but I knew you first as a short story writer. So what has the journey of this book been like, if that's not too painful a question?
Yeah, I mean, people don't buy short story collections. It's really the moral of the story. So,
that's a sad moral, though.
Yeah, this is something like a lot of these stories are like quite old. Like some of these are from even before grad school, I think. Like maybe most of them are from like 2014 to last year. I wrote one the novella I wrote that in like the fall of 2023, and it is very apparent when you read that story. But I've always loved short stories, and I've always wanted to. I think I begrudgingly got into novels, and then I realized how much more fun it is to write a novel than a bunch of short stories. So I think that was also part of like putting it aside, was just like, well, these novels are just, there's all this electricity. And I was like, I knew eventually, and I hoped very deeply that eventually it would happen with the short story collection. And this collection, honestly, is something that I threw together last year when I was just so frustrated. I mean, the stories are old, like I'd already written all those stories except for the last one. And I was just like so frustrated with stuff that was happening in my career. And I just wanted to submit some stuff. So I just put this collection together and threw it at some people. And Arsenal was like, let's do it. And I was like, only if you let me make it good now, because I felt like I kind of like slapdashed it together. But it really, like, once I had sort of taken a step and been like, okay, let's just put all the weird stories together. Let's get rid of the more realistic stories. And then I had all these illustrations, and then I was like, I've got an idea for one more story. It'll be over quick. And then I wrote 20,000 words for Foundation. So yeah, it really kind of was like born out of some sort of like this energy of just frustration that sort of like snapped and got me to sort of just be like, I just really want to publish a fucking book of short stories. Pardon my French, but
well, you should be allowed to. From the perspective of a novelist, I wish that I could just throw together a collection of short stories. That sounds fun.
Yeah.
And at what point did the illustrations come into the plan?
I think that that was always something I wanted to do, just because, one, it seemed like the one marketing ploy I could do to get people to buy a short story. I just have very little confidence that someone wants to buy a short story collection. You all should, but short stories collections are great. But it was something that was like, okay, that's like a fun thing that I could do to make it sort of stand out as a short story collection. So that was always like an idea that I had, and because I miss the days when books used to have illustrations, because most, like back in the day, like every book had some amount of illustrations oftentimes, and it was just like something that seemed really fun to me. Also, this sort of like problem of the illustrations, which I realized was a large thing that I was putting upon myself once I just started actually doing them, because they were like 11 by 14, like ink and brush illustration. So it was like a lot more effort than I expected for that, but it was a lot of fun. But they were always there, and then especially once I decided to do the strangest stories, I was like, this will be. I was hoping that you'd like flip through and be like, why is there this weird monster with a pumpkin on its back? Like, I have to read that.
Yeah. That is also something too, like, for me to digest this idea that you're editing and revising the book, but then also having to
Yeah,
taken on this whole other task for yourself.
I love making work for myself.
Yeah. And then at what point did like the title come and the theme?
Oh, yeah, I think honestly, like years ago, I just occasionally will have these notes on my phone or whatever. It's just like title a collection this or title something that. And I think for some reason Bad Houses just seemed like a good, I think it just was some title that I came up with at some point. And then at some point I realized like, oh, this could be I started to recognize the stories that could fit into that and sort of started to think about the ways in which we could sort of define houses, you know, these sort of containers, like the body that's a house, the house is a house, the neighborhood is a house, the world is a house, you know, relationships as houses, like all of these sort of things that I feel like I always weirdly, there's always this sort of container, and I think it's maybe this sort of like political aspect of my writing in a sort of like personal political, not necessarily like politics, but like, I think that is like something that there's always some outside element that's sort of like controlling people and like shaping them that I think I recognized and was like, that works. Bad Houses. And it's like, sounds like a fun title. So yeah.
Well, it feels very cohesive, I have to say, even as everyone notes, these are like a weird and wild assortment of stories.
Yeah.
I am curious if it ever gets old to have people talk about how weird your writing is.
Yeah. I try to not say, I've tried to stop being like, oh, it's so weird, because like I feel like that's like me denigrating my own work to some degree. So I'm like, I try to be more like, oh, it's surreal, it's, you know, whatever. But it is weird. I mean, like weird in a positive sense, and I appreciate and embrace the weird. But it is, you know, with My Volcano, which is the strangest book, let's say, that you would ever read aside from Bad Houses, you know, it is a thing that I'm fine with it. I'm fine with being the weird writer.
Good.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about Grandpa's Bag of Bubonics Brood.
Yeah.
Which even, I mean, setting aside the title, which is so sort of viscerally fun to say, as you said, it felt like I sort of noticed your poetic flair the most in that story. But I also struggled to kind of intellectualize that story because I found it very emotionally devastating.
Yeah.
We didn't really get to the emotionally devastating part. And
there's enough hints at the emotional devastation, so going with
yeah, so like the premise of the story, you guys got a little bit of it from that excerpt, but basically there's like a young narrator living with his sister and grandparents. Mom has disappeared. And he has a Jesus action figure.
Yes.
He's cleansing people. So particularly like the passages where obviously the kittens are drowned, I found hard to read. And then sort of coupled with that, the way that the older brother narrator like protects his younger sister from all of these difficult truths that he's learning about. So I was just really impacted by it. And was wondering about, like, it seems to me that story works because of the humor of the narrator's voice, you know, coupled with like all of the very difficult things that are going on in his life. So I wondered about creating that narrative voice and if it just kind of came easily to you. And I also wondered, like, there's such a joyful way that this kid has of using language. Like if there's anything autobiographical in that. Like I wondered about you falling in love with language as a little kid as I was reading this.
Yeah, I don't know about that connection though. Obviously, you know, I started reading way too early. Like my mom taught me to read before I was supposed to. So I was real embarrassed when I went to school and they were trying to like read, and I'm like, yeah, I know that. I know how to do that, you know? So I think that language, I don't know. I mean, I think that it's also funny, like the way that you're describing this book is like the way that I could describe like your book, especially your most recent, like it's all like in terms of like very voicey and like the appeal of the voice and like the sort of devastation, but also that humor. Like I feel like these are things that we both sort of work in, and you, especially your most recent book. We lose? Wait, what's not mine?
Yeah.
Somehow I can never get the title.
That's okay, that's pretty close.
Yeah. There you go. What's not mine? No, definitely like if you like that kind of story, like kind of story that we're talking about.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. It is kind of my sweet spot.
Yeah. But I think that this narrator, I think the premise sort of pulled the voice And then the voice carried me in this way that I was not expecting. Like, I think I was probably thinking this was going to be a much funnier story when I started writing it. And then as soon as I got into it, I was like, no, this is not going to be very funny. And it is funny though. I mean, it is.
Yeah, and it wouldn't work without that, I don't think.
Oh no. Yeah. No, it's a very dark, strange story that I think that but I think that's something that I'm definitely like, I think when I've most connected to language is when it is are the writers that ride that line between like humor and like breaking your heart, and like this sort of like, because it's that sort of, it's an understanding that like the reader is there and you have to sort of take care of them, but it's also a way to like hurt them more, like making them laugh. Like there's all sorts of interesting pulls there in terms of like playing with humor, but also like somewhat is just like, when I'm just let go, like things will get weird and funny. I think I think this is one of those stories that I literally just like sat in my dorm room and wrote one afternoon and just like in a fever dream, like it just came to me. But I think it definitely like, I think that there's a sort of, and you might feel the same way, there's sort of like a way you get possessed by like the voice. And as soon as it sort of like has this energy that's more than just this thing that you thought up, like then it starts to sort of like, you're like in a dance with it. You're like kind of trying to control it, and it's trying to control you. And it's this very magical experience that is hard to sort of manufacture.
It is nice when that happens.
Yeah. It doesn't always happen, unfortunately.
No, and I wanted to kind of circle back to something you said about being frustrated with writing when you decided to put this together, because there are a lot of writers in bad houses.
Yeah.
So just to like call a few of them out, we have in Dumb House, which we heard a little bit about, 3 roommates who I think all work literary internships. That keep them from writing. They want to be writers, but they,
don't take internships, folks.
They're not writing. In Elephant, it's noted that while the narrator's partner leaves the house to work a job, that they are writing. They spend their day writing in a cafe. In Engagement, which I'd love for you to talk about at some point, an award-winning writer and adjunct professor hires one of their students to take over their social media accounts with all of these cascading implications. And in Foundations, which is the novella we've heard a bit about, the main character is not a writer, but is an artist. And she regrets, kind of amongst other things, thinking that she could survive as an adjunct professor, which is a job that many writers also take in order to survive. So we've kind of talked about how like the premises are really wild and wacky, but these really profound truths about life emerge from them. So this is another question that you might hate, and I can reframe it if you want, but I can't help. I can't help with all of these writers, and they often lack that spark of inspiration that you're talking about, like channeling that can sometimes happen. Like, what is the portrayal of writers in these stories telling us about either like the place of writers in the world today, or like the plight of writers in the world today?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of times my writers are just frustrated with the life part of life, which is, I think many of the writers probably sympathize with that. Like there's a lot of things that just sap you of your energy, be that even just like the news, or be that, adjuncting and making no money and sort of having all this like stuff that your brain has to always be doing, and you just know this other place where you feel whole and have all this fun that you just can't get to. I think that's really like a constant ache for me, especially as I've, had to take jobs and do things, teaching. I love teaching, but there's nothing that will like sap you of your creative energy sometimes than teaching. There are ways that it also refuels you, but especially, the one time that I was a full-time professor, which was last year, it was like game changing in terms of being like, oh, it's not so bad if they pay you. That's the trick. Yeah, it's that being underpaid and being the sort of like ghost in the machine. That's like, because that's sort of what being a writer is as well. Like you're just this sort of underpaid thing that like most people don't know who you are, and you're not necessarily Like, I feel like it's just like that's too similar to being a writer, that you don't have the space where you feel like powerful, or that you're being like cared for, or sort of like supported, or that you like your needs are being met to a point where you can feel comfortable. Like, there's all this idea that like depression or like despair makes you write better. It's like, no, that's not true.
A healthy bank account.
Like benefits, like healthcare, all that stuff that just you don't have to think about suddenly makes space for you to do all those good things.
If I may quote you at you,
Okay.
there's a line in Engagement. I didn't tell him how being on Twitter and Instagram had started to feel like volunteering to be flayed. Like I was slowly transforming into nothing but empty skin blowing in the wind. Relatable.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's also so frustrating about being an artist these days, is just like the ways in which you have to kind of be a personality. It's just like, I don't need to just read the fucking book. Like, it's just like, I don't know, like there's a lot of, I enjoy these sorts of spaces, especially like back when I was like, undergrad here, like going to like events here, going to events at the university. It was always like fun to just see these like people that maybe I read before or whatever. Like this was the way to see their personality. And that was really exciting. And I think that's what drove me to go to events like this. And now it's like, you gotta like have a TikTok, and it's just like, I don't have the goods to do TikTok well. And it just feels like I'm making all this stuff that like basically nobody looks at and basically does nothing for you. Really, that's what it feels like. So yeah, I described it better in the story. So read the story if you want to know how frustrated I am with having to be a public person.
Well, as a writer, I have to say I really appreciated the portrayals, because there's more than one, right? To all of these different angles on the experience of being a writer. Should we do like one more and then go to read a little bit more?
Or go back to the podium.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to read now from just the story moving parts, and it'll be a slightly longer reading, I think. So, my left pinky was first. During the icebreaker at my college dorm's first floor meeting, when I was asked to give 3 interesting facts about myself, I lifted my pinkyless hand. The first fact was, I grew up on a farm about 5 hours away. The second fact was, I lost my left pinky after I moved in. And the third fact was, there's nothing else about me that's interesting. People nodded, the RA smiled and thanked me. Then the girl across from me with the pigtails spoke. When Mom picked me up that December for the winter break, I came down with a backpack full of clothes to meet her, the dark gray family car stark in the snowscape. And I hugged her long and hard until she pushed me away and pulled off my left glove. Then she put it back on. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. And when I got home and hugged Dad for twice as long, he didn't notice. Not until I was handing boxes of Christmas decorations up to him from the crawl space, plainly favoring my right hand. He held my left hand and looked at it a while. For my birthday in March, Mom drove down from the farm to buy me dinner. Dad was busy weaning the calves with my little brother. My older brother was supposed to meet us for dinner, but an hour before said he was too busy. Over our bowls of Mongolian stir fry, Mom handed me a small gift wrapped in blue. Inside was a little finger Dad had carved for me out of tamarack wood, with a strap of leather nailed carefully into the bottom that I could use to secure it onto my hand. I put it on. The tamarack pinky was the perfect size and shape. Mom smiled at me over our bowls of stir fry. He must have used his own finger to scale it, she said. On the inside edge of it, where I could always see it, he'd carved love pops. When summer came and I moved back to the farm, I didn't lose anything. When I went back to school that fall for my second year, to the same dorm but on a brand new floor full of brand new people, I lost my right ear. My fun fact that year was I decided to switch from fine arts, and only after did I lose this ear. The RA laughed and the rest were polite. I sat back down. When the guy to my right talked about himself, I didn't hear a word. On Christmas morning, Mom gave me the hat with tall elf ears sewn into the sides to wear while we opened gifts. I pulled it down onto my head and stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. When summer came and I moved back to the farm, I didn't lose anything. I worked the fields, moving cattle for daily grazing, cutting hay for my little brother to rake into swaths that Dad would later bale. At the end of the summer, I got in the car with Mom at 6 in the morning and we pulled away. I tilted my chair back and took a nap. I was excited to live in a fancier, quieter dorm that year, sharing a suite with a friend. When I woke up, we were halfway there, and I didn't have my right foot. My shoe sat empty on the floor. My suite mate and I didn't go to the floor meeting that year, but if we had, I would have had my script ready. What I wouldn't give for 2 left feet. A gift that Christmas was one heavy woolen sock. For my birthday, a very beautiful shoe. When summer came yet again and I moved back to the farm, I didn't lose anything. Dad said, thank God every tractor clutches on the left, but he didn't let me drive on the highways between the fields because I couldn't pair the clutch with the brakes. At the end of the summer, my older brother moved back to the farm and my little brother went off to college a whole flight away. I wondered if I would ever see him again. That fall, I moved back to the same dorm with the same suite mate. But while I was hurriedly crutching down the hall, I slipped and hit my face on a doorknob and broke a tooth. That Christmas, my little brother came back intact. I was shocked. My older brother, on the other hand, after being on the farm a little over 4 months, had gone completely bald. By the time he moved back to a friend's couch in the city a few months later, his fingernails and toenails had all fallen off. When summer came back around, I didn't go back to the farm. I moved into a new apartment with my older brother. I had a summer job as a research assistant. When my brother came to pick up my stuff from the dorms, his hair was growing out again. He had eyelashes. His fingernails were halfway to the tips. When I crutched into his apartment for the first time, I went into the kitchen to get a beer and tried to open the fridge, but couldn't reach the handle. I had to crutch a step forward before I could. The fridge's door had been too far away the first time because I had lost an eye. I worked, and when school kicked off again, I schooled. I was finally living off campus in the apartment with my brother. I had 1 extra semester to get through to finish my degree. I stretched that semester across a whole year because I didn't want to try to start life after. And because I didn't want to try to start life after, I looked into grad schools. I sat at my computer late into the night, staring at a blank page, tapping my tamarack pinky against the control key, over and over until something came. I applied to schools in far-flung places. By the time the summer came around again, I returned to my research assistant job. I was set to go to grad school almost 2,000 miles away in New York. When I responded to the acceptance, I had trouble breathing. It stayed troublesome for a week, and I went to the ER and they said that I had only 1 lung. Didn't I know? I didn't know how to answer that question because I think that I did know. I think I knew the second before I clicked the mouse button to confirm the acceptance of admission. And that's that.
Parts.
That's not the end of the story, by the way. It's just the end of my reading. It keeps going.
I'll quote you again a little while later in that story in speaking about like workshopping in this writing program. The narrator says, what I wrote was picked apart for its connection to the parts of me that were missing, which, you know, we're talking about the weirdness of these stories. Obviously, the weirdness here is the parts of the narrator vanishing.
Yeah.
But it's like a very sweet story too. And I think one of the ones with maybe the happiest ending.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Slightly creepy, but maybe happy.
A little creepy. Yeah.
You'll have to read it to find out.
Yeah, so tell me about writing a story. I'm curious, like, when meaning emerges for you. Like, you come up with a premise, it's fun, it amuses you, sometimes you write it all, you
Yeah.
know, in your dorm room in a day or so. Yeah, how does that happen? How do these truths come to you?
I mean, I think that unfortunately, oftentimes it does come quite early. I like to, it's nice when I have to figure it out, but sometimes it is, usually I have a very clear vision, like, and for the stories that I finish, like there's like, you know, with Grandpa's Bag, I probably, once I was like a page into it, I had the sense of where I was going, like this is what the story is about. This is about, you know, this connection between this brother and this sister and this sort of like, how do you cope with this loss and how do you move, what does it mean to be, I think it was like probably when I wrote that, the line about like badness being a hard thing to permanently, like this idea of like, what does it mean to be good and like, can you be good and still, like, can you survive in the world doing the things that are good? Like, many people can't. Like, I mean, there are lots of people that have to do, you know, the bad thing in order to survive. And I think that was something, like once I sort of found myself there, I think I figured out like, oh, there's something here. Like, how can I play with that? So I think oftentimes there is at least a sense of what question I'm writing for. Like, I don't think I would say that I'm the meaning in a sort of like moral sort of sense comes to me, but I have a sort of question. It's like, I want to think about it. This is a story, this is fun, but like, how do it's oftentimes like, especially with these stories, like I have a funny idea. And they're usually, I mean, all of these stories you could sort of say like, at their, you know, these two roommates have this roommate that just decides to become mine one day. That's kind of funny, but it's not a funny story. In the same way that like moving parts is like this person, like every time they move, they lose a part of themselves. And that's kind of an amusing, bizarre kind of thing. But like, that's only, like, it can't just be that. Like, I think that I learned a long time ago that like, you need to have more than just like a laugh or like a joke. Like a joke has to have the, and I think that's where all of this sort of conversation we were talking about earlier in terms of like humor, like in order to be funny, you have to like make someone cry. I don't know, like there's all this like, you know, like reading, I think a book like Catch-22 by Joseph Heller was a book that I read in high school that really like sort of shook me in the sense that like, that book is like so funny, but also like so sad. Like I can't even reread it because it's not funny the second time, it's just sad. And I think that that really sort of gave me a sense of like sort of humanity behind this sort of like, I don't know, that things can be funny, but they should also be doing something. And some things can be fun and it still kind of, and it's like a gift to the reader, but there's always this sort of other pull that I feel like. So oftentimes my stories have a sort of funny premise, and then I have to think about like the way, well, how can I make this thing more than that? And sometimes oftentimes that is like, what is the like trauma of mine that I can like give to this, or like what is there about my own experience that I can maybe express through this? Like I think that's oftentimes, because like it's funny, but like I gotta put some blood in it, like and that's what makes it interesting. And that's what makes it, I think, where you become meaningful. Because otherwise, I mean, and there's nothing wrong with like pure funny, but I think that the best stuff is that plus the heart. You can't just have that.
I heard you quote George Saunders at another reading, and he said something about someone calling his stories like sort of cruel, because they were maybe like more idea forward or humor forward. But I don't think, like perhaps
his early stuff, it is.
Well, and I don't think that any of your work like has that quality of like beating the reader over the head with like, look at all the tricks I can do. You know, there's always like a real beating heart there.
And I can probably thank Saunders for that. I mean, because, you know, especially like just that understanding of him getting this review that was just like, these stories are just mean, kind of. And he was like, fuck you. And it's like, and then he realized like, oh, it is mean. And he started writing from this sort of place of love, and it added all, I mean, they're still super funny, they're still super satirical, but they have this other thing that's sort of, because if you read those early Saunders books, they're kind of mean, and some of that slaps, but some of it is it just kind of wear on you in a way that like his other books feel like they're so much more like fully lived. I don't know.
Well, Moving Parts is certainly like like moving, you know, the way like the father carves the tamarack finger, pinky finger, and when the parts vanish, they wind up back at the family farm.
Spoiler alert, but
And are sort of lovingly tended to by the parents. Like it's weird, but there's a lesson, a moral,
an
you know?
allegory.
Can we talk about elephant for a moment?
Of course.
Do you want to explain the premise briefly?
Basically, it's what if an elephant in the room, but the elephant in the room is dead? Like taking that, like the metaphor of the elephant in the room, but making it literally an elephant in the room and is dead and rotting over the course of the story, and you're just dealing with this rotting elephant and trying. So it's just this couple that are sort of. They live in this really small studio apartment, and there's this dead elephant on their queen-size bed, and they're just like trying to live their life as if this isn't there, and it's very funny.
It's really gross.
And then it gets really, and then there's maggots, and there's vultures, and it's just and they eventually just like cut it up and do all sorts of But
again, very moving, and we don't know anything about their relationship really. I think it opens with a line something like the morning after, but we don't know the morning after what really. I guess I don't really have a question so much as I have like compliments, but I think it's like one of the best breakup stories I've ever read. There's a moment at the end where like they sort of reach some sort of agreement and work together to dismember the elephant and clear it out of the apartment. And it's like so. And
then they just keep taking the rest of the apartment, throwing it all out. Eventually, like the girl like picks up the other person, like carries them out to the dumpster.
Yeah, they're dismantling their life together, like metaphorically and literally. Well, good job. We have a couple minutes left. I wanted to ask you about foundations. It is the longest story, and it sounds like the most recent story.
Yes, I literally, after I sold the book, I was like, I'm gonna write one more story, and then I wrote that. I can't imagine this book without it.
I really enjoyed it, and maybe it's because the main character is an adjunct prof, maybe it's the Midwestern setting, but also maybe it's because it's like we had to stay with them for a little longer, right? I loved the movement between like the present tense story and then the flashback sections. And it sounds like it came very naturally, but I can't imagine being such a free writer. Like I would, if I wrote 60 pages or 20,000 words or whatever, I'd be like, well, maybe this could be a novel. No pressure from yourself to.
I think honestly it was probably helped because I was writing it for this fucking book, and I was like, it can't be that long. Come on, and I think I'm always, unlike you as a novelist who sometimes writes short stories, like I'm like, if possible, I don't want to write another fucking novel. I mean, I love writing novels, but everything, like I don't want anything to like overstay its welcome. So I'm like, and in some ways, I was probably blessed by the fact that I had this book and I knew that probably they would publish whatever I did. Because Arsenal was very good, they trusted me, and it's a good story as well. But like knowing that like I was writing it for this book, and the book was a little short anyway, so it's like I knew I had some wiggle room. I think that helped it sort of me know that like I didn't have to worry about it maybe being a novel. And I think that like also, I mean, I like to sort of think that like some of my short stories, I'm trying to like fit a novel worth of stuff in there. Like I don't think that all of my stories, especially not Foundations, I mean, it's a novella, but like a lot of my other stories as well that maybe didn't make it into this book have, I think, a sort of like, I mean, like Blueness, I think is one of those stories that to me feels like one of a story that I could make a novel, but I think I just compressed it as much as possible because it has all this other, like it has more than just like that one kind of code turn like in terms of like the structure.
That's another story that I really enjoyed. I love the description of, is it Margarita? Character? She abruptly decides to leave her life on the East Coast and just kind of melts away, like doesn't say goodbye to her roommates, sneaks out the back door. Like the way that's described is so like sad and devastating, you know?
Also, don't we all have that fantasy sometimes though? Just like slip away and nobody knows where we went.
Lies to their job. And, So I guess just sort of continuing on about my foundations question,
yeah.
how do you know, as somebody who writes poetry and short stories and novels and graphic novels and draws, is there ever any confusion about what you're working on and what it is?
I think I wish that there were more confusion, and I'm trying to sow more confusion into me so that I can have, because I think I've been sort of very good about setting the boundaries of like what is what, like this is a novel, this is a short story, this is a comic. And I think I've been very good about picking, I think, the right forms for things, but I think that's something that I'm trying to think about. How do I complicate, how do I make short stories into a novel? How do I make, you know, a comic into a poem or whatever? Like, I think that's something that I'd like to get better at, because I think sometimes I'm a little bit too, like, this is what it is. And I mean, like, obviously, like with fiction, I think I don't necessarily know, but I'm always desperately trying to not have to write another freaking novel if possible. But oftentimes it does become a novel. You don't know how many novels that I need to finish. Like, and yet I keep starting new ones.
Well, I admire your plethora of ideas. And I, as much as I said, you know, I love foundations because we get to stay with these characters for longer.
That's why I really enjoyed it as well. Like,
yeah, but
so much,
I think it's the perfect length though. It would be nice if we could, if more novellas came into the world, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
What are you working on now?
I mean, like a month ago, I was really trying to work on this novel, this sort of speculative novel about like state violence against trans people, which maybe is more thinking about it. I'll definitely get back to it, but I just did this like little writing prompt that I invented, and I just started writing a whole fucking new book. So I'm writing that right now. So which is a collection of short stories that are interlinked, and I think I'm thinking about it more as a novel and stories to some degree, and that's been really fun. It's called Guest Services at the Museum of Sexual Deviance. It's very different. I mean, I'm exploring all sorts of like, I'm writing way more sex scenes than I've ever written before. So it's a lot of, I'm just sort of like having fun. And I also work in an art museum now. So I'm like using some of that in my stories. And I'm also maybe working on another novel, unfortunately. And hopefully at some point I'll finish illustrating my graphic novel. But yeah, I'm just, right now I'm kind of just letting myself, because it's been just a weird year and it's just getting weirder, but I'm just kind of letting myself write. I've decided like, screw finishing a project that I think that I'm supposed to finish. And I'm just like, whatever will get me to put my pen on the paper is what I'm doing. So right now it's those two projects, this new maybe novel and the weird sci-fi museum story. Yeah.
Well, I would encourage you to keep writing whatever you want. I think it works well. We're just about at 8. Is there anything else, any other stories you want to talk about?
Oh God, I don't know. There's so many. I mean, no, we've done a pretty good job. It's funny, like some of these have like Winnipeg connections, and then I just was driving here and I passed the elephant apartment, which is very like weird to me. I'm like, yeah, that's the story. That's where I was inspired to write that story. So yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a really nice full circle moment.
Yeah.
I get to say what everybody wants to say, which was, that was a remarkable conversation. Thank you both, and beautiful readings. I think we should, yeah, let's make a noise. It's so exciting to hear writers talk to one another about their writing, but there's something very special when there's this long history where I can hear how you are tracing each other's movements as writers, and then there's this kind of, we get to look in on a friendship as well as a kind of an integrating idea about like, what is happening in these stories. And I have to say that I was a little bit, I had to apply a little extra pressure to get out of my house tonight to come over here, and I suspect probably quite a few people in this room have spent the last few days feeling pretty grim. And I just want to have an extra thanks for sharing stories that have weird, hard things in them, like rotting elephants, you know? But also that really deep humanity and heart. I think this is how we all have to take care of each other in a time that's very difficult for all of us. And I suspect that your museum book will hit a few people in a place that will hurt in just the right way. And I guess I just wanted to thank you especially for kind of taking on the weirdness and the hardness and the bizarreness, but also with that kind of speculative edge. I found all those disappearing body parts really funny and very moving and just a little bit terrifying. And it seems to me that is the voice for now. So I'm really, really grateful, and so lovely to hear the way that your conversations kind of opened it up for all of us who haven't yet had a chance to read this book. So congratulations, and thank you for coming back.
Yeah.
It's really, really good to have you back.
I've been trying for years.
I know.
Sincerely. Yeah.
We've all been trying, and we did it. So now I'm supposed to explain to all of you this really complicated part now about getting your book signed. So it's really tough. So next, John Elizabeth is going to come and sit over here, and then you're all going to come up here and get a book signed. So I hope that's hard enough for all of you. The real tricky bit is that you need to pay for it before you leave the store, because they just do it like that. But before we kind of escape into that state where you can have more conversation space, I would like to make one more thanks to Arsenal Pulp. I really think they have done some of the most exciting books of the year. And I'm not surprised they snapped up this collection of short stories. And just for the record, I suspect there's a lot of people in this room who love short stories, love that form. People who love to read, love short stories. They just last forever, I think. Yeah. And the other thing I'd like to invite all of you to do is make a little noise for John, who's hiding behind the curtain here, who always makes these events go so smoothly, and to McNally Robinson, that is just such a core part of our community and the health of our culture. So let's make some noise. Thank all of you for coming, and we'll be back together with the folks at McNally to do some events after Christmas, but we all need a rest now and some time to read. Thank you for coming. Come on up and buy a book.